On this edition of Independent Sources, our special coverage of the general elections continues with a look at the ethnic and immigrant media and some of the stories making headlines in their communities.
Independent Sources, your window to the city's ethnic and immigrant communities. Your host this week, Zyphus Lebrun.
Mainstream media has reported on everything from Donald Trump's bombast to Hillary Clinton's bout with the flu. But we haven't been hearing too much about what's been happening and being said in community papers. This week, we wanted to take a closer look at the ethnic and immigrant media and some of the issues they've covered over the last few months. With me in studio is Rong Xiaoqing, who reports for the Chinese paper Sing Tao Daily. And Odette Keeley is joining us via Skype from the West Coast. She is the executive producer at New America Media, an umbrella organization that covers news from ethnic and immigrant communities on the West Coast. Ladies, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zyphus. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So let's just get started with you, Rong. Let's talk a little bit about the Chinese community. Is the Chinese community paying a lot of attention to this general elections in particular?
Yeah, definitely. The Chinese community is paying a lot of attention, or as much as attention as the mainstream people, because they're part of the country as well. And this is such a critical election.
Mm-hmm. I'll get back to the critical nature of the election in a bit. And I just wanted to hear from you, Odette, what's it like on the West Coast? Is it a similar kind of energy that we've kind of been seeing here on the East Coast about the election?
A lot of energy among first-time voters, a lot of energy among immigrant groups. And I think the context of this, Zyphus, is really about what this election season has become. It has been one of the most ferocious, one of the most polarizing. It's been marked by a really extreme range of anti-immigrant rhetoric, xenophobic comments that, of course, immigrant media, ethnic media are very much vigilant about and monitoring, even more so than before. So that's really been the context of what we've seen. And a lot of what I'll be citing is really because the New America Media's press network is national, beyond California, beyond the West Coast, really looking at some of these bureaus that are also located in New York and many other cities in the United States.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You know, Rong, Odette just mentioned something, this whole issue of xenophobia and how there seems to be, it's very, at the base of this kind of election, there's a lot of it. It's fermenting. Is that something that you've kind of reported on at Sing Tao?
Yeah, definitely. I think the way we reported on this election is the difference between us and the mainstream media is we focus a lot on immigration issue and China issue. And for example, over the debate, we really counted like how many times Trump mentioned China and how many times Hillary mentioned China and the way they mentioned China. So yeah, and also because of the rhetoric of anti-immigrants that is flowing in this campaign, in the campaigns and the election, and people are following closely on the words they use and the policies as well.
You mentioned the fact that both candidates during the recent debate, how many times did they talk about China?
Oh, Trump definitely win. Trump mentioned China at least 10 times. Hillary probably not even one, or one. Hillary was one, and Trump more than 10 times.
What was the reaction? You guys reported on that. What was kind of the reaction in the community? Were people upset about it in the context?
Well, it's not so much upset because this is not a surprise to them. From the beginning of their campaigns, both candidates said a lot of negative words about China and about the competition between China and the US. But on the same time, a lot of people do believe this is only the campaigning words and the campaigning choice of words.
Right.
They don't think when either candidate win, they don't think China-U.S. relationship will recede.
Right, of course, it won't suffer. What's it kind of been like from what have you been seeing, Odette, as regards to reactions to both candidates? Is one candidate, are folks kind of leaning towards one candidate over another?
There were, the landscape of endorsements and the landscape of where the sentiments or the support may have been is really such a mixed bag. But I wanted to stress there were three arcs, three themes that we saw emerge in this presidential season. And I mentioned xenophobia, I mentioned the fear of the other, I mentioned the anti-immigrant rhetoric. And Latino media, for one, have always considered themselves a watchdog and really tracking these anti-immigrant comments, statements from candidates historically throughout the years. But this has really been, as what we've seen, a very serious, very extreme spectrum. What we saw as one arc was that Latino media and the Latino diaspora actually, Zyphus, became at the heart, at the center of the narrative of this election cycle. From when Donald Trump first announced his candidacy, including in his speech the accusation that Mexico brings criminals and rapists and drug dealers, and that he would and declare that he would be building a wall. He's really good at that. To Univision news anchor Jorge Ramos, headquartered in Miami, being kicked out of his campaign rally, and in subsequent editorials explaining to his readers and to the general public that it is not advocacy. And it is not advocacy, it is about him as a journalist holding candidates like him, holding those in the public eye accountable, especially for someone running for office, and everything else in between, to even Trump's, of course, visit to Mexico with the Mexican president, Enrique Peña Nieto, and what that whole backlash and the whole aftermath of that. Both figures, in fact, are very unpopular among Latinos. And now, very much in the aftermath of the first debate, we are in this backlash and continuing tweets, I think up to 4 days after, from Donald Trump about Alicia Machado. You have LatinoRebels.com saying, this former Miss Universe and how she was given that central role and highlighted by the Clinton campaign, by Hillary Clinton herself. She's not perfect, and who is? She has a past, who doesn't?
Right.
But the fact that he continued to react and insult her really put the Latino diaspora right in the middle. And that's the role that Latino media has played for itself. A second arc that we saw with Asian media, with most media, is that there really was a combination of what are the issues that are important to them. That includes homeland issues, that includes international affairs, that includes the kind of grasp of foreign policy that these candidates had. And so you had with Filipino and Vietnamese media, for example, what is the stance of this candidate when it comes to the South China Sea territorial dispute? And I know I'd love to hear more about Rong's perspective on that in terms of the Chinese coverage. For Arab American media, Arab American news in Detroit, in Dearborn, Michigan, it's one of the biggest Muslim Arab American newspapers, a scathing op-ed published on its papers in the aftermath of the first debate, that for both candidates, it wasn't a substantive discussion at all about the Middle East conflict. There was such a lack of substance. They almost felt it was used as a prop. Hillary Clinton has talked about her foreign policy in a much more substantive way. And of course, not much was expected from the Republican candidate. And lastly, Zyphus, I have to say, in the discussion of this presidential election for African-American voters, for African-American media, it cannot exist without police violence, the context of police violence. Very, very recently, the Washington Informer out of Washington, D.C., its publishers, in fact, the chairman of the National Newspapers Publishers Association, NMPA, they had recently done a press conference and declared what they call police brutality state of emergency in Black America, and declared that the time for talk is long gone. So you had the chairman of the NNPA, you had leaders within it who are also publishers. For example, the one of the board members is the publisher of the Tri-State Defender of Tennessee. And you had the president and CEO of the NNPA saying, if you want to secure the African-American vote, politicians have to understand that they need to address this issue. The issue of police brutality is not seen as isolated cases. They see it as a national pattern of violence and attack and discrimination against African-Americans, and in fact, a national pattern of prosecutorial misconduct.
Right.
They gave a 4-point plan that they submitted to the president, the current president, President Obama, to the members of Congress, to U.S. Attorney General Lynch, outlining what they want politicians to address.
Right. Now, Odette, you mentioned a lot of what you were talking about there kind of speaks to that traditional role of ethnic and community media as being essentially the voice, the spokesperson, if you will, the voice of the voiceless, that, ethnic media has traditionally taken on that role. And I wanted to bring it to you, Rong, is, the first thing Odette brought up was the role that the Spanish media, the Latino media has kind of taken, standing up and speaking out on behalf of the community. Is the Chinese media as vocal as regards to speaking up on behalf of the Chinese media when it comes to the Chinese community, rather, in the context of just general election?
Mm-hmm. We, first of all, we do cover a lot about the election, but we don't tend to have some kind of like unified voice for the community, because the community is not one community.
Right, it's not monolithic, right, of
yeah,
course.
and especially for the Chinese community, on issues like U.S.-China relations, everyone agree on like a better relationship is better for everyone. But on immigration issues, that's the part there are a lot of different opinions. I think Trump's campaign did a great job by sending out this kind of a message as saying that the immigrant community are divided into legal immigrants and undocumented and illegal immigrants, and they try to turn those two groups against each other. That works well in our community, I think.
Really? So pitting folks against one another?
Yeah, because like even during the comprehensive immigration reform, during those previous years, when the country is trying to push the reform, there were different opinions. Those people who follow the rules and getting H1 or follow and to get their green
card,
work
permit and so forth.
They are saying, okay, it take us 7 years to get a green card, and then undocumented people, if they apply for political asylum, it only takes them 2 years. So that's unfair, and there were some kind of words like that. So now it's even like the conflict even sharper.
Right. We're going to have to stick a pin in this conversation, and we're going to have to take a break right now, ladies, but we'll have more of the discussion right after this. Thanks for staying tuned to our look at the ethnic media and their coverage of the general elections. With me in studio, Rong Xiaoqing, and joining us via Skype is Odette Keeley. So, Rong, I want to start with you. You recently wrote an article about the Chinese community and their support for Donald Trump. I'm very curious as to who are these people in the Chinese community who are in support of Donald Trump?
I think in general, this community is still like the majority still support Hillary Clinton. And the people I talked about in that article, I think there's still like a small portion, because traditionally the Chinese community has a long history, long relationship with Hillary Clinton. When she ran for senator in New York, this community helped her a lot. So this is a long time relationship. Trump didn't really involved with this community at all. But what surprised me is during the current election, there are some people who I thought should be in Clinton's pocket are supporting Trump, including a lot of new immigrants. If you define new immigrants as people who have been here for maybe less than 20 years, compared with those who grew up here. So new immigrants, including educated people and grassroots people, street vendors, even like former undocumented immigrants,
are in support of Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Really? Now, this seems to run a wide cross-section of the community, from wealthier to not as. What was the common factor there, did you find, in these people who were supporting him?
I think they are people who haven't been in this country for so long. So they probably still remember the way they deal with things in China, because China is such a homogeneous country, and it doesn't, people there don't have any patience for things like political correctness. So they think Trump's way is like a direct talk and say things as it is.
Right.
And that's why and also I think in their mind there is this zero-sum game.
Mm-hmm.
They think probably if Trump stop Middle East or Muslims coming into this country, it will be better for legal immigrants,
right,
who have already been in this country.
Right. Odette, what's the, on the flip side, what have you seen as regards to support for Trump in ethnic communities? Is it something where you're seeing that he does have a strong backing in ethnic communities?
I think the only aspect I could point out is actually kind of just a tag team on what Rong is saying, something that we kind of tracked in just a broad way in terms of Chinese media, was that there was support, as Rong was saying, but what we were seeing was because of his cadre, his niche as a businessman, and to look at that experience as somebody who's going to make the economy better. And I'm actually curious to see if, at the aftermath of this debate, this is still a sentiment among Chinese American voters in terms of what Rong is tracking. In a larger sense, for all other media, I think it's very indicative, Zyphus, in this election, there's been such a dominant narrative that you have two candidates who are so polarizing, and some people and many in the ethnic media themselves have considered them two of the most unlikable, two of the most disliked candidates, that for many, they don't actually see a clear choice. Earl Afari Hutchinson, based in Los Angeles, he airs the Hutchinson Report on radio out of LA and SoCal, says at any other time and place in history, it would be almost unbelievable to say, because his op-ed was about why Hillary Clinton was very close in ranking to Donald Trump as the most disliked candidate in history. Wow. But I think it really speaks to the perceptions of the coverage that it's out there, both in terms of Hillary Clinton and the secrecy and the server and the shroud of deception around the email scandal, the email server, and many other things that also relate to her foundation. And then you have a Republican candidate, Donald Trump, with a very extreme anti-immigrant, a very polarizing view of the immigrant communities. Just to actually say, La Opinion, which is one of the biggest Spanish language papers, it's part of the Impremedia group that is national in scope, has bureaus in New York. The newspaper there is El Diario New York, and I believe you've had them on your show many times. La Opinion is based in Los Angeles, and they do have a historical record of endorsing candidates on their editorial. That is not something we have seen yet.
Right.
So that in itself is telling, but you would be hard-pressed to see support for Donald Trump among the Latino media.
Right.
La Opinion has published several editorials against him. There's been a hashtag Nunca Trump as an editorial, Never Trump, editorial that our Spanish language media monitor translated and published on the NAM site, which is La Opinion warning its readers against Trump. And I think what struck me about this editorial was that not only is it pinpointing, what has already been discussed so widely, that Trump is a candidate who has insulted the Latino community, has questioned them and called them rapists and murderers, and fomented such fear and hatred, but has created this movement that they say, regardless whether he's elected or not, he has already created a movement of fanaticism and hate that will remain. He has upended the political infrastructure to such a degree that it's an aftermath that all of us will face. So in that editorial, they say Latinos are under attack, and it's an attack on all of us, meaning all communities of color. Lastly, I have to say, we did find one endorsement, one clear endorsement. It was very early on, it was in June, by the Korea Times.
Right.
Again, national in scope, has bureaus in New York, DC, all the major cities, and California, endorsing Hillary Clinton. At that time, she was still battling Bernie Sanders. It's very telling, though, Zyphus, maybe I'm going to end right here, in terms of what they said about Hillary herself. Even as they endorsed her, as they consider her as the most popular, most well-known politician for Korean Americans.
Right.
But that she is not perfect. She's flawed.
Right.
She has to earn back that trust and restore the credibility after the email scandal. But they do consider her as someone who has the sound judgment, the diverse political experience that she can bring to the White House that will actually maintain stability in the relationship between the Republic of Korea and the United States. And really, this is a candidate that they say will be a pro-immigrant candidate and will fight for immigrant rights.
Okay, we're due for our next break right now, Odette, but I want to come back to talk about Hillary when we come back for a couple of final thoughts. So stay tuned and we'll be right back. And welcome back. Rong, Odette, just before we left, you were talking, Odette, about Hillary Clinton and the Korea Times and the full-throated support of the Miss Clinton. One of the things that I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about in terms of her is how is her gender playing a role in this conversation that's being had in, for instance, the Chinese community? Because I know traditionally there's been some issues in ethnic communities where women don't have as much political clout, they don't seek political office in some cases, and we can get into that. But how is her gender, how is her gender playing a role in the conversation?
I think you're right, Zyphus. Traditionally, Chinese expect women to be gentle, to be like soft speaking. Hillary Clinton definitely is not this kind of a woman.
Right.
But any woman who, if you want to run for office, you can't be like soft speaking.
No.
So how much that affect their choice? I didn't hear anyone really say that, oh, we won't vote for her because she's not a traditional good woman in our concept. And also, this is a community who has elected Congresswoman Grace Min, Councilmember Margaret Chan. So I don't think in the actual effect, her gender will play any role.
And just to pick up on what Rong said, that this conversation about women in ethnic communities being leaders, we have seen international women as leaders and locally as well. What's it like? What are you hearing kind of on your end of it, as regards to the West Coast and other media?
What's a striking juxtaposition, Zyphus, is when we think about the Filipino-American media and their coverage of it, or the Filipino diaspora's perception. It's very striking because we have a homeland history of electing first female president in the region, and that's Cory Aquino.
Right,
so we have
Aquino.
that legacy, we broke that bamboo ceiling, and it's also seen here in the United States in local races, in Congress. That's still something that the community is still pursuing. But her gender is not something that I'm seeing, for example, in Filipino-American media as an issue. I do hear, and I was very fortunate over the weekend, had caught Fareed Zakaria's show, GPS. He had Australia's first female prime minister on, and talked about that kind of gendered discrimination, the gendered treatment of her that seeped in kind of very insidiously, almost quite hidden. And she's known for what's now known as the misogyny speech that she delivered in government, in parliament, in Australia. And she does recognize that in so many ways, how Hillary looks, how Hillary sounds, with the perception of her being, gosh, she's got to be a tough kind of woman to actually have gone through this, to have been a lawyer, to have been a first lady, to have been Secretary of State. So that is a barrier that's seen right there. For so many, though, the perception of Hillary Clinton is a question of trust. Again, from the history and track record of both she and Bill, with the foundation, with the email server, and a Frontline documentary, really kind of put all that in a great context into how, in the very early years of her life, the kind of career path she took was really in terms of how to shroud things in privacy and how to protect yourself in order for that not to be used against you. And that's a hurdle she needs to overcome.
We're running out of time, so I just wanted to get a couple of final thoughts from you ladies. Rong, going forward, for you, just kind of where you going with your own coverage of this election, where do you feel like is the next step for you as regards to covering this election?
I'm really curious to see that whether on the day, on the election day, whether there will be as many Chinese people go to vote as we hope. Because I do hear people talking about, as Odette mentioned as well, this is a tough decision. And I do hear in the community people are saying, oh, we don't know who to choose. Maybe we just stop, we just don't go. We just don't go to vote. And that will be the worst thing we would want to see. So I think that's the focal we're gonna see on the election day.
Perhaps concerns about a low voter turnout because of the feeling of uncertainty. What about you, Odette? Are those concerns being echoed over on the West Coast as well?
One last major theme that's definitely an overriding apprehension, and so much of what the community advocates, civil rights groups, frontline activists are doing on the ground is to really emphasize how precious and how valuable, how important the right to vote, to exercise that right, to become a new citizen and exercise that right to vote is in terms of making your voice heard and making a difference in such a high stakes election. One of the last things I wanted to share was we had the opportunity to explore the landscape of voting rights and voter suppression, voting rights barriers in many different communities in a mandate that we were given nationally. We tracked 11 states, and recently we did 3 media briefings in Atlanta, Texas, and Arizona. And the coverage of both Latino media, there was a series by Univision Politica, Jenny Manrique, that looked at 3 cities. You see the whole landscape of the lack of language materials for Latino voters, for Native American voters. So you also had Native American media, Anthem Action News covering that for Arizona. In Georgia, it was about gerrymandering, where districts, the redistricting around that, where counties are marginalizing voters, Black Latino voters. For the first time, there was a Black and Latino coalition to file this lawsuit against this county. And lastly, in Texas, this is the whole crux of the outreach in a culturally sensitive, in multicultural materials. The Texas ID voter law, in fact, had been changed, but there was no outreach in Spanish to Latino voters and Latino communities. So there is such a great role of the ethnic media in disseminating all this information, in mobilizing all of the voters of color, populations of color, to exercise the right to vote, not to throw our hands up in the air and think that our vote won't matter, because it does. And it does in swing states where the ethnic vote is seen as very much in play and very much a force, a possible way to swing results. We saw that in so many ways in history where such a very small margin meant every vote mattered. And that's the message that's out there in the role of ethnic media disseminating this information.
Okay, Odette, thank you very much. Well, Odette and Rong, thank you very much for being in studio with us. That's our show this week. Thanks again to my guest for being in studio. Join us again next time. Until that time, be independent-minded.